My name is Linda Sobczynski, and I am an attorney in the Energy and Natural Resources Industry Group at Farella, Braun and Martel. I'm joined today by Dr. Bob Haddad, who's the Group Vice President and Principal Scientist at Exponent, Matt Stein, who's the Vice President of Business Development at Jupiter Intelligence, as well as Nick Moore, who's an associate with me in the Energy and Natural Resources Industry Group, as well as a fellow UC Davis Law alum. Today, Bob and Matt are going to talk about advances in managing extreme weather risks and liabilities for industrial infrastructure and operations. And Nick and I will talk about climate change, legal risks, and responses. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Look at that. Let me go ahead and advance this. So this is a very long title. What we're really going to try to do is we're going to try to give you a bit of an overview of some new tools that we think are very useful, especially in industry, but in all industries, not just kind of oil and gas industries, to better evaluate and update risk analyses for businesses in terms of what the climates are likely to bring. Matt and I will be tag teaming this. Matt's a great guy, as you'll get to hear. And then we will talk a little bit about the roles of our specific companies in the midst of the presentation. So I'd like to just start off with some facts. This is a website that is updated every year by NOAA. And in this website, they plot the billion-dollar disaster event types by year. And these are CPI adjusted. And so this is not just looking at floods, not just looking at rain events, it's looking at heat events, it's looking at tornadoes, et cetera. But the real point to take home from this is the dark line on the bottom, and to see the increase in terms of the billion-dollar disaster events as a function of time. This chart is actually up to date as of the middle of July, in which during the first half of this year, we had approximately $140 billion in costs due to these extreme weather events. This is a slide that came out in the Houston Chronicle after Harvey, and it just simply gives you an overview of the Houston area, the Houston Ship Channel area, and then all of those dots represent facilities, either chemical facilities or energy facilities. And what came out of Harvey was, of course, over 100 chemical releases due to the flooding, due to power failures, et cetera. And so far, at least one series of criminal actions against Arkema. So this issue of seeing these large events become more frequent as we come forward in time, we've been talking about this for the last few years as extreme weather events. And of course, there's no secret that we don't say climate change, because when you walk into a boardroom in Houston and you say climate change, you get asked to leave. And so we try to come at it from a slightly different pragmatic way of looking at what it's costing them. And it's not just us. I mean, every week, I have to update this slide all the time. And in fact, I put this slide together a couple of weeks ago. If I were to show you what this slide looks like today, there would be another picture up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen that says, in the Bahamas, Dorian revealed rising storm threat to oil infrastructure. And what you want to say is, no shit. So clearly this is something that's hitting the kind of the just the normal person's head on a day-by-day basis. You can look at, if you guys were looking online this morning, you will have seen a football stadium that looked like a pond because of some heavy rains in the Midwest earlier in the week. The other thing I wanted to kind of point out in this slide is that it's not just rains, it's not just floods. It's the whole concept of how climate change will affect the way that we use and have access to natural resources. And industries that are very interested in looking at it from that perspective are entities like the mining industry, who want to understand what's their water source look like out over the next 10 to 15 years in order to understand how their operations are going to change and whether or not they'll be able to survive in terms of their compliance with their permits. In the financial sector, this is certainly something that is being seen and talked about, and Matt will talk a little bit more about that from the insurance perspective. But here's an article from last year where they just talk about some of the blind spots, underestimating the magnitude of the costs, need for adaptation strategies for releases that are going to go beyond the fence line, not thinking about things in a linear way, but looking at non-linear climate risks, potential for ecosystem-based intervention, and that is, can I do some resiliency work around my facility to help me increase the overall resiliency of my facility? And then finally, we're now talking with folks about cost benefits of how you look at these risks and then adapt to these risks. So we look at this very simply. There's kind of a first step is a hazard analysis, and then we'll talk a little bit about a vulnerability analysis, and then finally, kind of a consequences analysis of that vulnerability. And with this, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Matt Stein.
Great. Thanks, Bob. So just to give you a sense of, what do we mean by a hazard analysis? Essentially means what climate variables you're exposed to as a company, as an organization, as a city, and how does that shift over time? So one of the ways we like to talk our clients through, what does this mean for them, is, let's think about any given company. In this case, let's think about a utility, which is very timely, given what's going on right now with some of the power outages. But instead of fire risk, let's think of any given climate variable. We might think about temperature as an example. So different pieces of equipment, different operations have different thresholds in any business, utilities included. So if we think about a given threshold, in which case let's consider 95 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days in a row, right? That happens to be a really important threshold for one of our customers. Because at that point, when their substations experience that temperature, that particular frequency and duration, and intensity and temperature, they have vulnerabilities, right? Their reliability goes down, the network reliability goes down, there's fines, there's all kinds of implications that result. We can understand at a given location what that has looked like in the past. In other words, from sensor data observations, we know what that has, in this case, it's happened 3 times in the last 10 years. But projecting that into the future, there's a little bit of an art and a science involved in how do you do that. That's what our company does. Jupiter Intelligence is a 55-person startup. We are based in the Bay Area here. About half of our employees are scientists, many of whom come from the public sector, some of the public labs like NOAA and NCAR. But what we do is we take the predictive models around climate, which you may be familiar with some of those climate models, and we essentially downscale them or take the raw output, which is very coarse, 100 kilometers squared, and turn that into an output that's at the asset level so that you can actually use that output to make changes to your business decisions. So in this particular case, we're projecting out, and now we're seeing that over the next 10 years, that threshold is going to be exceeded 6 times, right? Again, that's a probabilistic view. It's a modeled view of the world, but it gives the client new information to make decisions, right? Make decisions around maintenance, make decisions around hardening infrastructure, and those types of things. Just to give you a sense, as Bob alluded to, right, it's not just about flood and heat, but these are some of the other perils that we look at. Wind happens to be a big issue in the industrial sectors as well, with towers and obviously hurricanes and transmission distribution lines and so forth. Fire clearly is a major, increasingly important issue, drought and hail. What we do is we provide hazard data at the global level, but also at the asset level for our customers, and we, sorry about that, we work across these clients right here. What we're finding is that specifically in the industrial sectors, there's a big concern around these issues. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but we work quite a bit in the oil and gas, working with the top 5 oil and gas companies, many of the utilities, and wherever there's a really concentrated set of exposures, of financial exposures and liabilities, they're thinking really hard about these kinds of issues. We also look at the implications of this for insurance companies. As you can imagine, there are implications if you're a mortgage holder or mortgage lender, rather, where you've got hundreds of thousands of loans outstanding in an area that is known to be vulnerable, for instance, South Florida or Houston or other areas that are very flood prone. So they're thinking really hard about this issue as well. What we believe is really important in this sector is a few things, right? One is being scientifically rigorous and utilizing all of the peer-reviewed models. 2 is really, embracing the fact that the future is not the same as the past. You can't just use a set of statistics on, as Bob had showed from the NOAA data, on past events and project that linearly into the future. Scientifically, you can look at the models, that's not what the models are reflecting. So really embracing that idea of non-stationarity is really important. High-resolution spatial modeling, we really believe this is important because to the extent that you can get higher and higher spatial resolution and you can start to unpack other dimensions within the data, that's where you start creating data that's really decision-worthy for enterprises, right? It gives them some of the uncertainties, gives them a lot of different dimensions that they can use to make good business decisions. Purpose-built, what we do as a company is essentially we have built a cloud infrastructure to run these scientific models at scale. Scenario-based, as many of you are aware. Wherever there's uncertainty, we try to simplify that uncertainty by creating scenarios. In the case of the climate models that globally we all look at and depend on in terms of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there are different emissions scenarios that we look at to try to quantify the range of outputs that we can expect to see in the future. So we sort of straddle all of those scenarios. And then expert validation, it's really important, especially when you're talking about predictive models. It's very hard to validate something that's projected to happen in 10 to 20 years. So there's a lot of techniques that we can use based on data science and other modeling where we actually go back in time and sort of project out the performance of these models. So it's very important that anyone operating in this space has a really strong plan and way of executing and showing how their models are validated. Bob talked a bit about this, but essentially this is how an Exponent and Jupiter do work together. This is how we think about sort of the end-to-end risk management framework around climate. So at the one end, you've got companies that may have assets all around the globe, and they, at a very high sort of macro level, they're very interested in just almost the intellectual question of, where amongst my 2,000 assets around the globe am I most exposed to steep changes in all of these climate risks that we've talked about? And then knowing that information and anecdotally just knowing the facilities that are at higher risk based on prior events, that's when they dig into, trying to understand at a very fine level of detail, well, how is my facility exposed to these changing risks? That's what we talk about as climate risk quantification. And then where firms like Exponent really start to enter the equation is understanding, well, if you're exposed to this risk and it's changing in this way over the next 10, 20 years, this is what it could mean in terms of physical impact. This is what it could mean in terms of structural damages, structural thresholds being exceeded, mechanical failures, electrical failures, and so forth. And this is what that can equate to in terms of an economic cost or damage function. In some cases, the cost benefit doesn't actually merit that the company do much. It just basically says the company is willing to hold that risk. In other cases, it's very clear that there's a changing cost-benefit equation, that the company needs to do something. They need to make some sort of investment or change the way that they think about insuring their asset. Quickly, I'll give you a quick view of just to sort of hammer home how some of these risks are changing. This happens to be a petroleum storage facility on the East Coast. So what you're looking at is a 1% flooding event. There's a 1% probability that this event would occur in 2019. You're looking at a compound flood hazard. So that's essentially compounding different ways that flooding happens. So flooding happens through precipitation, through rivers, through storm surge, and the climate compounding effect of all that. In other words, precipitation is getting more intense over time. Those storm surges are actually getting compounded from a rising sea level. And there's obviously a zone of uncertainty around what that rising sea level, there's different scenarios around that. So if you just scroll forward by 6 years, right now we're looking at a low sea level rise. And there's actually not that much change from this year to 6 years from now. But if you just toggle that to a high sea level rise, you'll immediately see, and I'll just go back so you can get a sense of the depth is changing, the extent of the flooding is changing. This is all based on scientific analyses. And then if you take that same high sea level rise and you scroll it forward another 25 years, well, then you can see a pretty dramatic change, right? You can see a strong change in depth, and about half that facility is underwater in a 1% event. That's not even thinking about the more severe events, right? A 0.2% event, which would be thought of as a 1 in 500 year event. But the idea is that this 1% event today, it's not a 1% event tomorrow, right? The probability of these events, this exact event, is changing over time. And then you can take that one step further, and again, this is where a firm like Exponent comes into play, and really understand for each of the critical assets on that facility, what are the thresholds? What happens when it exceeds a certain threshold? And how do we anticipate those thresholds, the probability of those thresholds getting exceeded in the future to sort of change? Every facility has its set of Achilles heels, if you will, to these different climate variables, and what we're trying to work with industry on is really to help them understand these shifts in climate and help them understand what they can do about that. So I'll pass it over to Bob.
Great, thanks. So with this information, we can then start thinking about what the vulnerability of the asset might be. And Exponent is well situated to do that. Maybe some of you have worked with Exponent before. Maybe you've worked with us before in our former life as failure analysis. But the guts of what the engineering side of our company does is really looking at why something failed. And this process just turns that around and uses all of that experience and asks, when will something fail? So in terms of what we're trying to do is we're basically taking the data, the information that's coming out of the Jupiter analysis, and when we are looking at the impact of those data in terms of forces and stresses on the assets there. They can be pipelines, they can be tanks. Once we've done that, we can again probabilistically take a look at what are the likelihood of failure of those things. And then if it fails, what does that mean? So this is a very, very quick slide. I don't want to dwell on it for lack of time, but each one of these scenarios is basically a different step in terms of understanding the vulnerability. What's that vulnerability that the floodwall or the levee will basically break? Well, if it does break, then what are the chances that we're going to knock the tank off the pedestals? If that happens, what happens if the tank breaks and product releases? If product releases, where's that product going to go, and what are the probability that it might cross the property line? And so we use this information to provide this kind of probability analysis, if you will, of hazards. Here's the vulnerability. And now that we have the vulnerability output, we can actually start estimating what the risks are, what the consequences of those vulnerabilities might be. So simply speaking, if you're looking at a facility and you've got a flood coming in, you have the potential for all kinds of problems. Obviously, releases into the environment, not only through the air and through the water. You've got the impact to the human health. You've got impacts to ecological health. All of these things need to be considered as part of the consequences because from a liability perspective, they'll have a fairly significant footprint on the company's future profitability. So we look at this, we've kind of adapted an EPRI model that we developed that looks at relative risks effects. And we look at what are the chances of a release. If it is a release, what are the chances that there is going to be human health exposure? That takes into account what is the toxicity of the material being released, where is it going, how people are exposed, et cetera. Same thing, we go through an ecological exposure analysis. And then ultimately, those things get pulled together into an estimate of the financial impact of that consequence. And then these are pulled together as relative risks using a variety of scenarios. And the outcome is a consequences versus likelihood table. And this table then is provided to corporate risk folks, and they can start looking at this, and they can start doing their cost-benefit analysis, asking those questions. Is it cost effective to go and harden those tanks right now, or is it not? So with that, this is a nice little example that Matt's going to go ahead and provide an overview of.
Yeah, sure. So this is just an example of, when I mentioned validation before, what you're looking at on the left is essentially the observational data from Hurricane Sandy in New York City. In the middle is a view from, actually on the left is the FEMA flood map. In the middle is a set of observational data from Hurricane Sandy, and then on the right is just a quick sample of an output from Jupiter. The idea here, again, is that we're trying to push the envelope on the science. In a lot of cases, the data that we rely on as a society happens to be government-funded, and in some cases, there are inherent weaknesses in that. In terms of making critical decisions on that data. I can go into some of the details of what the shortcomings are around FEMA data, but I won't spend time on that. Suffice it to say that the more sophisticated risk-based decision makers in enterprises are starting to find other data sets like ours to sort of rely on and make these mission-critical sort of decisions. So when you think about that level of data plus some of what Bob is talking about here, all the way down to the environmental liabilities, it's really and the fact that all of these risks are changing over time. It's a little bit of a mindset shift, a new sort of paradigm for companies to not just think about the current risk, but how that risk is sort of shifting over time.
Evolving, yeah.
Just a few more messages to leave you with before we pass it along to have more of a legal discussion. We're seeing, and this is maybe just some of the trends that we're seeing in the marketplace. As we continually engage with customers jointly and separately as organizations in the oil and gas sector, the utility sector, mining. Chemicals, just heavy industry in general. what we're finding is that the companies, and this is quite obvious, right? But companies engage from two perspectives. One is they have existing facilities, and other is they're building new facilities. From the standpoint of existing facilities, they're thinking about this in sort of two different dimensions. One is the operational dimension. So in other words, there's a hurricane event that's coming up the coast. There's a set of uncertainty associated with that. What does the outcome of that event mean to my facility in 3 days, 2 days, 1 day? And what should I do about that, right? And what's the uncertainty around that? Because making decisions about emptying the tanks, right, or clearing the site, those are really big decisions in some cases. So you want to understand the uncertainty associated with that. From a planning perspective, now we're hearing a lot of companies, especially one of the plants that was highlighted on all the dots that Bob showed in the Houston shipping channel. One of those specific plants is asking us, well, we almost got flooded. Our substation almost got flooded in Hurricane Harvey. We know we need to elevate it. We don't know if we need to elevate it 2 feet or 10 feet. Help us think through that. Because there's a bunch of different economic implications with each of those. On the new facilities, site selection is clearly a big issue, right? How do we select the site? How high up do we build the plant, and so forth? Thank you.
You're welcome.
From the perspective of just a risk management, the World Economic Forum does a study of the largest global risks on enterprises' minds, every year. And over the last couple of years, extreme weather risk and changing climate has been at the top right of the emerging sort of risk category. If you looked at that chart 4, 5, 6 years ago, cyber would have been in that area. So there's a lot of, this is a new vector of risk for companies. And there's a lot of similarities. If you asked folks in IT probably 7, 8 years ago about cybersecurity, they would have said, well, that's interesting. What do we do about that? We're still in sort of that same sort of realm, actually, with climate risk. This next point, especially in facilities and industries where water is really critical to their operations, what we're just starting to see the beginnings of is how does changing water supply or changing water risk, how does that sort of feed into their operational models? And as Bob was talking about, now we're talking about running these operational models in the future with different inputs. So that's just starting to get operations and other functions within these businesses to think about these kinds of risks. I would say at a high level, it's obviously important for companies to think about these non-stationary risks in their businesses. What I've observed is that they're coming about this in two different ways. At the one end of the spectrum, they're coming at it from a top-down. The risk department is starting to talk about these things. The general counsel is starting to talk about these issues. Safety and operations, this is becoming an issue. And they're almost doing a tops-down analysis of, well, here's all of our exposure. You plant manager in this location, you need to do an in-depth analysis. But what we're also finding is that some of the plants from sort of the bottom up, like the example I mentioned before around the substation, they're saying, you know what, I'm not going to wait for you at the corporate level to come up with a systematic way of viewing this. I've got an issue. I'm not willing to take this risk that the next Harvey is going to flood my facility and I'm going to have downtime and safety issues and so forth. So I'm just going to move forward and do an analysis of my property, my facility, and myself. So we are seeing sort of from the top down and the bottom up. And the last thing I'll mention is that on the next slide is that this is definitely a topic that is really important to the C-suite of the companies that we work with, and it's not important to every company out there. So what we're finding is that, like any sort of new set of data in analytics, there's a subset of every industry that cares about this issue. And generally, those are the companies that have a little bit more of a long-term view as they think about their own business. But specifically, the people that care about this issue, we've seen enough instances in the news over the last, say, 2-3 years even, where CEOs are getting fired, criminal investigations, so on and so forth, that the CEO cares about this issue. Even more so if there is in recent memory an event that they personally experienced, sort of that cognitive bias issue. If they don't take this seriously, what we're starting to see, and we're engaged in a lot of conversations and some work in the insurance sector, where insurance firms are starting to push their clients around this issue. The types of insurance firms that we've noticed that are really grabbing hold of this issue are the ones that are more sort of engineering savvy, if you will, and you may know of those types of firms, or the ones that are generally mutual firms because they tend to have obviously longer client relationships. They don't view their clients as sort of a one-year contract that they sort of flip on and flip off every year. They're more invested in their client relationships. And then perhaps even more so than the insurance industry, because at the heart of the insurance business model is really one-year policies. The banks. The banks are really jumping into this and trying to understand, hey, if we're holding 10, 20, 30-year risk, and some of that underlying risk is changing over time, well then what does that mean in terms of our sort of underwriting criteria and how we think about holding these risks and how that sort of changes some of the risk metrics and ratios on our books over time. So bottom line here is that there's a lot of different actors in the economy around this issue. And I'd say we're still at the very early days of this, right? We're still just a couple of years into really thinking about how this data becomes relevant for the enterprise, right, industry. And it'll be interesting to sort of see how this plays out, but I can tell you there's a lot of activity, a lot of different corners of the economy that are starting to sort of jump in and explore what this means for their own businesses. And with that, I think that concludes our section of the panel.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Matt and Bob. So now we'll be shifting to the legal side of this issue. So that's kind of our general overview here. But basically we'll be going through some cases that illustrate the threats of climate change, both from sort of a physical and legal standpoint, and then discussing some potential responses. So we'll be focusing sort of on how the private sector is facing the consequences of climate change, more so than the causes. So I'm starting with Massachusetts v. EPA. It's a very significant case for a lot of reasons. Most of you have probably heard that name before. I won't get into too much detail, but in short, a 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court held that the EPA had the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. So standing was a contested issue, which you'll see is sort of a theme in these cases. As you can see from reading the slide, the court pretty thoroughly described sort of the physical impacts of climate change, and it held that because rising sea levels will negatively impact coastal states like Massachusetts, the states had standing. Probably the biggest takeaway from the case is probably just the fact that the Supreme Court was now on record saying, not only is climate change happening, but more importantly from a legal perspective, it's causing a cognizable injury. And the decision effectively established sort of the credibility of prevailing climate science in the courts. Maybe the most direct consequence was that it led to the actual regulation of greenhouse gases, which is something that in California we're pretty familiar with at this point. So in many ways, this case set the stage for all the climate litigation to follow. And to that end, plaintiffs in each of the next 2 cases I'll talk about cited to the case simply for its recognition of sort of the seriousness of climate change's potential impacts. So the next two cases that I'll talk about are both filed by the Conservation Law Foundation against Exxon and Shell, respectively. So in a little bit, Linda's going to get into some of the more creative claims being brought, but these next cases that I'll discuss represent, I think, what are going to be the most common ways in which climate change will present issues that attorneys and other professionals are going to have to deal with. So I'm going to talk about these two cases sort of as one case because they're very similar. In both cases, plaintiffs brought claims arguing that the companies had violated the Clean Water Act by failing to account for climate change in the design and maintenance of their waterfront facilities. So as you can see here, Exxon has a terminal in Everett, which is right on the Mystic River and flows into Boston Harbor. So, the kinds of impacts we're talking about here are essentially those that Matt and Bob were discussing just moments ago, such as the possibility that sea level rise and worsening storm surges will result in potentially catastrophic chemical and pollutant releases. So at the center of both the Exxon and Shell cases were the company's permits under the Clean Water Act. These require the design and implementation of stormwater prevention plans, which the plaintiffs argued were inadequate in light of sort of the intensifying effects of climate change. The defendants countered by pointing out that the permits really said nothing in and of themselves about requiring consideration of climate change. What they did require was the use of, quote, good engineering practices and an obligation to update the plans as needed, largely for safety reasons. But nevertheless, in Exxon, the court denied a motion to dismiss, holding that the permit requires Exxon to consider foreseeable severe weather events, including any climate change-induced weather events, in developing and maintaining its stormwater prevention plan. Unsurprisingly, standing was also at issue in this case. So as you can see on this map, there's just a number of the plaintiffs were nearby residents who claimed that they were going to be affected by some of these potential consequences. So the defendants argued that the complaint identified only distant and speculative risks of climate change, while the court recognized that some of the harms wouldn't occur until the distant future, decades down the road. Other consequences, such as documented increases in severe storms and flooding, were imminent and sufficiently so to confer standing on the plaintiffs. During a hearing, the judge in the Exxon case he made a statement that I think encapsulates how these issues really play out and will continue to play out. He said, quote, "You all want to talk about climate change. I'm more focused on foreseeable severe weather events, whether they're caused by climate change or acts of God." So in other words, he accepted the evidence that there would be increasing risks to these facilities, regardless of the ultimate cause. So I think there are a number of takeaways from these types of cases. One is that I think climate change impacts are going to be increasingly read into permits and permit conditions, even those that don't explicitly address climate change. In addition, although the impacts of climate change are necessarily uncertain to some degree, as Matt and Bob are kind of discussing here, detailed factual information is critical, whether you're filing a claim or defending against one. For instance, the complaints in both the Exxon and Shell cases were very detailed. So in light of this detailed analysis, the defendants had a difficult time developing a response. So you can see this is an excerpt from, I believe, the complaint in the Shell case. It's worth pointing out that there are entities out there that are increasingly performing these kinds of analyses, including our co-presenters here. The plaintiffs in both these cases sort of demonstrated the importance of that. Even though they were relying on government agency work, which, as Matt and Bob were kind of discussing, isn't always the most sophisticated. It's still sort of sufficed here, at least to state a claim. Shell relied on a FEMA flood map and the slosh model referred to here. That stands for the Sea, Lake, and Overland Surges from Hurricanes model that's put out by the National Hurricane Center. And that was used to bolster the plaintiff's case. And that was rendered sort of visually in this slide here. So the kinds of concerns raised in these cases have particular relevance to us in the Bay Area, where so many people and businesses are located in the immediate vicinity of the Pacific Coast or the Bay. So in a place like this, it really can't be stressed enough that all businesses and industries, and individuals for that matter, really need to do their homework and research the potential risks to their specific locations and facilities. And of course, as Matt was saying, take that information into account when planning their next moves. So the last slide, or last case rather, that I'm going to talk about is a Sequa case. So for those of you who aren't familiar, that's the California Environmental Quality Act. It requires developers of a wide range of public and private projects to analyze and then mitigate the impacts of those projects on the environment. So when we're talking about Sequa, we're often sort of flipping the focus a little bit from the impacts of climate change to the causes, and that's because in recent years, amendments to the Sequa guidelines have enhanced requirements on project proponents to actually quantify greenhouse gas contributions. So in turn, they're often required to mitigate those impacts in various ways, including by purchasing carbon offsets. I mean, we could do an entire presentation just on quantifying greenhouse gas emissions under Sequa and all the case law that's been coming out on that issue the last couple of years. But in this Ballona wetlands case, the climate change issue arose in a slightly different way that I think is a little more in line with our presentation today. The case involved a proposed mixed-use development in a coastal wetland area. Petitioners challenged the adequacy of the Environmental Impact Report, or EIR, that was prepared for the project. They relied largely on a paper published by the California Climate Change Center, which forecast that the project site would, due to rising sea levels, eventually be inundated by the ocean. The court agreed that the possibility that the project site would eventually become inundated was indeed a potentially significant impact of the project on the environment, which is sort of interesting, and so it required analysis. But in this case, unlike in the Exxon and Shell cases that I was just talking about, the defendants had, in a sense, a rebuttal in the form of a third-party report that relied largely on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that concluded that the project area was in fact unlikely to be inundated as a result of climate change. So the court determined that the EIR thus contained adequate analysis to satisfy Sequa. So in conjunction with the Shell and Exxon cases, I think the lesson here is that really the only way to sort of defend against these necessarily data-based claims is to have better data. Ultimately performing analysis of the risk presented, like Matt and Bob do, or citing the work of someone who's already done that kind of analysis is really the only way to protect against claims that you're not adequately prepared for climate change. And of course, this kind of preparation is not just a way to guard against liability, but it helps businesses anticipate and avert the physical impacts of climate change itself. So with that, I'll turn it over to Linda.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm going to talk first about Giuliana, and my presentations are going to be about emerging litigation strategies as well as judicial limitations. So Giuliana has gotten a lot of media attention because it asks the novel question of, do we have a constitutional right to a stable climate? The lawsuit was brought by 21 youth plaintiffs against the federal government, including Department of Interior, Department of Energy, EPA. And the plaintiffs allege that the government's irreversible and catastrophic interference with a stable climate system is going to have resounding impacts for future generations. They say that the conduct, if not fundamentally altered, will have even worse consequences for future generations. They ask the court to order the defendants to stop what they're doing, permitting, subsidizing fossil fuels, and ensure that the atmospheric CO2 levels are no more concentrated than 350 parts per million by 2100. Why 2100? Well, in 2100, sea level rise will increase potentially by 56 inches, global temperatures will increase by 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ocean might be 150% more acidic than it is today. We also think or hope that in 2100, these plaintiffs are still going to be alive and potentially living in these hostile conditions. So what are they claiming? They're claiming violations of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, a violation of the equal protection principles embedded in the Fifth Amendment. The right to a stable climate is an unenumerated right preserved for the people by the Ninth Amendment, and that the government has violated the public trust doctrine. With respect to the violations under the Fifth Amendment, rising sea levels, what we've been hearing about all today, they say that that's going to harm plaintiffs' life, liberty, property. Relatedly, since defendants knowingly enhance the danger by promoting the use of fossil fuels, the plaintiffs should be treated as a protected class. They can't vote, they're too young. At the time of filing, most, if not all, were under the age of 18. So taken together, these things, depriving life, liberty, property, not being able to do anything about it, and needing special protections because of that, they're saying that the government has violated their Fifth Amendment. They also argue that there is an implied right to a stable climate, even though it's not enumerated in the Constitution. The stable climate, they say, is an implied right that's inherent, inalienable, natural, and fundamental. This right is preserved by the people in the Ninth Amendment. Finally, plaintiffs argue that the government has failed in its public trust duty to protect air, river, sea, these things that are common to all of us. They also interestingly argue that they're not going to be able to hold these things in trust for future generations once they get to power, because of the irrevocable damage that's currently being done. Defendants moved to dismiss, their request was denied, and they appealed that to the Ninth Circuit. In the meantime, the plaintiffs have moved for a preliminary injunction to make the government stop issuing leases that will allow fossil fuel extraction. On June 4th, just a couple months ago, the Ninth Circuit held a hearing on the interlocutory appeal and preliminary injunction. We're still awaiting that order. Giuliana is just one approach. I'm going to talk about a number of common law cases. Questions later. Okay. Regarding climate change, the County of Marin Case alleges public and private nuisance, strict liability, negligence, and trespass causes of action against the defendants, who are the fossil fuel industry. As seen on this slide and the one I'm about to show you, Marin is concerned about the impacts of flooding that flooding will have on its infrastructure. So here's a picture of potential flooding in Marin. So Marin is claiming that defendants caused or contributed to greenhouse gas pollution, and as a result, they will experience these climate-related risks. Because causation is an essential element to the strict liability, nuisance, negligence, trespass claims, the plaintiffs will need to show that defendant's conduct was a substantial factor in causing the alleged harm. California case law tells us that the substantial factor standard is a relatively broad one, and that the contribution just has to be more than negligible or theoretical. However, proof of causation can't be based on mere speculation, conjecture, and inferences. There must be some real evidence. So we'll see how this plays out. Now the case is in the Ninth Circuit on the question whether or not it should be remanded to state court. The argument is whether the Clean Air Act or federal common law preempts state law claims. But going back to this issue of causation, this was a fatal problem for the plaintiffs in the Giuliana case. Villagers there alleged that the breach of the federal common law of public nuisance for unreasonable discharge of greenhouse gases was causing melting sea ice, and their village would no longer be protected from harsh winter storms. Relocation would cost anywhere between $95 and $400 million. but the court had a hard time seeing how a fact finder could determine this case. The fact finder would need to consider what other options the defendant had in the past, what cost to society that other path would have had, and then compare that risk to the flooding for the villagers. The court expressed concern that the fact finder would not be able to reach a reasoned conclusion based on everything they would need to consider. The court dismissed the case because plaintiffs lacked standing for 2 reasons. One, this was a political question that's not suited for the courts, and they also couldn't establish causation. Article 3 standing requires a plaintiff to show injury, causation, and redressability. To meet the causation standard, the plaintiff must show a fairly traceable connection between the alleged injury in fact and the alleged conduct of the defendant. Plaintiffs conceded they were unable to trace their alleged injuries to any particular defendant. The Ninth Circuit affirmed. And these issues of standing, political question, causation are significant obstacles for plaintiffs. In particular, this uncertainty about getting to the bottom of causation and damages is something that played out in the City of San Francisco and City of Oakland municipal cases. These are pretty similar to the County of Marin case that I just talked about. On this slide, I have an excerpt from the City of San Francisco case to highlight the types of things that plaintiffs are demanding. They sought an order requiring defendants to pay for a seawall to protect infrastructure. But before the court could decide if that were an adequate remedy, it wanted to know more about climate change and how it related to the conduct of the defendants. The court held a landmark federal tutorial, and the parties had to answer a series of questions ranging from micro to macro issues. For example, what caused the various ice ages, and what caused the ice to melt? Why aren't plants picking up the slack, I'm paraphrasing here of course, and absorbing more CO2? What is the molecular difference between carbon dioxide and oxygen and nitrogen? And why does carbon dioxide absorb heat? Does carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reflect any sunlight back into space? What about the collective heat from tailpipe exhaust, engine radiators, and other sources of combustion from fossil fuels? What's up with that? Ultimately, the court said that it accepted the science on climate change, but that this was a question for the government and not for the courts. This sounds a bit familiar. And also, nuisance is not the way, or nuisance tort is not the way to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. This has been appealed to the Ninth Circuit. So what are the takeaways here? Be prepared for the new normal, as we've heard from Bob and Matt's presentation. Consider climate impacts in permitting land use decisions. Obtain advanced analyses, especially as a rebuttal of your defendants. And be aware of new litigation strategies, but also their limitations. So, as we've seen here in these slides, how is a fact finder going to be dealing with these issues? Are these issues appropriate for the federal or state courts? Are these issues going to be heard in federal or state court? So stay tuned for climate change litigation and what's going to come up next. Thank you. So we have 10 minutes for questions. Actually, less than that, 7 minutes. So Lauren, do you
She's a
want to take
taskmaster,
it
too,
away?
so.
Now, I'm just wondering, for Giuliana, were all the claims allowed to go forward? Was the whole
We're not even there yet.
Okay,
So we haven't even made it. So there was a motion to dismiss.
right.
That was then appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and there was a lot of procedural questions there about whether or not the district court was even going to certify it. And then as a final determination, sorry, getting ahead of myself, the Ninth Circuit is going to figure out whether or not the trial is going to go forward and how that's going to proceed. So there's been a lot of procedural going around between the federal government filing like an extraordinary writ of mandate petition to force the trial court to certify the motion. But there's a lot to be determined yet. We don't know really what's going to happen with Giuliana.
So I'm just curious, obviously a lot of these companies need to do the analysis on how to prepare for climate change. But how are they going to, I mean, you can have the recommendations, but have you seen, I guess, their thought behind how they finance these improvements that, you know, you would be recommending or other companies would be recommending. And, you know, that is really a long-term view. And for a lot of companies, I would assume that they're just really more concerned about the bottom line today as opposed to 5 years from now.
So I'll let Matt talk about the financial side of it, but I will say that the mindset is pretty much as you've described it. I don't have discretionary income to basically be able to deal with something that is a probability. I need to keep my asset profitable. And that's what Matt was trying to get to in that last slide, where he talked about the fact that it's really trying to break through at the corporate level, at the C-suite level, those folks who presumably are looking 5 to 10 years down the road for the long-term good of the company, not for this year's budget, to see the importance of doing that. And then how will they finance it? I'll let you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I sometimes joke with oil and gas companies, maybe I take a little too much liberty here, but I tell them, you know, you're not going to move your entire refinery up on stilts, right, in 1 year. That's just not feasible. But you can move your substation, again, like I said, up a few feet this year. You can move some tanks a little bit up next year. You know, it's more of a sort of scalpel approach to capital planning, right? All of these facilities, all these companies have a line item in their budget around capital expenditure. Now, there obviously comes a point where, you know, maybe they've taken their eye off the ball on this issue and they've now realized that they're a little bit behind, that to actually outlay the correct amount of capital expenditure to keep them at a risk level that they're satisfied with, it's going to be economically really challenging. And we've actually seen some companies sell off those assets. They're just not willing to be the ones carrying that risk. So there's a couple tools in their, you know, toolkit to be able to sort of think about this flexibly.
But when you say they sell off, do you think they sell it off at a discount because of that, or is it?
They might. I mean, it depends. Honestly, it
Depends on that due diligence.
the due
doesn't it?
diligence of the buyer, right? And we're actually seeing, even slightly different, but in the real estate sector, you know, we work quite a bit in that sector, and folks that have a 10-year hold period on specific assets, you know, when they buy that asset, you know, they need to now think about 30, 40 years, right, into the future and how that risk is changing, because they know that 10 years from now, when they sell this asset, the buyers are going to be thinking about this, and they're going to be thinking about their next set of buyers. So
it's actually an interesting field that's growing, at least at Exponent, in terms of not just the due diligence normal, but really that financial aspect of the environmental consequences of the due diligence. So we've had a large client in the Midwest who wanted to sell off a lot of the assets, and they decided they wanted to sell off the liability as well. And so they brought us in to evaluate what that liability was and what was an appropriate premium to be able to put on that liability as they went forward with the transaction. Yeah.
Just picking up on what you said about due diligence, though, the current norm is that there's no legal obligation to disclose, like, say, you own these tankers that you showed on the East Coast that are going to be immersed in water in 20 years under a 1% event. And they say, okay, we're not going to do that. We're going to just become a cash company. We're going to sell everything and then go invest in, I don't know, solar panels. But, so when they sell all that off, as quickly and reasonably as possible, there's no obligation for them to say, hey, by the way, you might want to get this analysis done.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And there's nothing new here. I mean, I did a case in the South Bay here in the early 2000s where my client was Waste Management. And Waste Management made a decision to purchase a dump in the Alameda Hills that was a little bit down from the mercury mine. And because of that decision, they ended up being a party to a circlicide and a natural resource damage assessment. And so there was a failure of them doing the due diligence that they should have done. So nothing new there. I guess what we're saying is that if you're a company that is now looking to acquire that, it's not just kind of the tried and true models you need to be thinking about, but you need to be thinking about how these impacts may change as a function of climate change and what that does to your due diligence analysis.
And I'm gonna have to stop our presentation here because we've hit 11:45, but we'll be sticking around for a few more minutes before the transition to the next presentation for lunch. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thanks
thank
to
you.
our
Thank you.
speakers.